I live on a quiet street in a suburb of North Carolina. It's the kind of neighborhood where the houses are close enough to say hello to your neighbors, but not so close that you can spy on what they're doing inside. I'm a normal guy with a simple life, and for a couple of decades I've shared this place with a couple known as the Bennings. Ryan and Laura were known to everyone, and over the years we had become friends, but everything changed that day. I hadn't seen Ryan and Laura for days, which is not like them, as they were always busy in the garden, walking their dog or chatting to me when I passed by. I tried calling them, but all my calls went straight to voicemail. I also knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I told myself that maybe they had left town without telling anyone, which would be strange but not impossible. As the days went by, my concern began to build, and the only sign of life in their house was an endless stream of food delivery people leaving bags at the door that nobody collected. I began to think that maybe they were sick, too unwell to get up and open the door, and that concern grew as the days went by. So when I passed by their house, my gaze lingered for a few moments on those bags piled up in the doorway. Laura loved to cook, so why were they ordering food? Why hadn't anyone picked it up? One night, around 11 o'clock, curiosity got the better of me, so I stuck my head out of the window when I saw another delivery man parking in front of the Bennings house. The guy came out, left a bag on the doorstep, and left without anyone answering the doorbell. But something about his attitude seemed strange to me, as if he were on autopilot. This was too much, so I decided I had to find out what was going on. That afternoon, I approached the house, trying to look in through the window, and the first thing I noticed was that the lights were off, and there didn't seem to be any movement. I tried to convince myself that I could wait a little longer, but the worry was eating away at me. I remembered that Ryan and Laura used to leave a key hidden under a pot near the back door, in case they were forgetful, and as we had been friends forever, I knew that trick. When I got to the back, I lifted the pot and there was the key, so I opened the door with a loud, "Hello, is anyone home?" As I crossed the threshold, I was immediately struck by two things. The first was that there was no response, and the second was a horrible smell. A penetrating and nauseating stench that immediately made me retch. It wasn't the aroma of spoiled food. It was something very different, something that made my stomach sink and a feeling of deep fear settle into my being. With my heart in my throat and praying to God that I was wrong, I ventured into the kitchen where bags of food were lying everywhere. I called out again to Ryan and Laura but got no response, and as I entered the living room, the mess took me by surprise. Magazines were scattered about, the furniture was out of place, as if someone had had a fight or had been looking for something in desperation. But my gaze stopped on a dark stain on the floor, which sent a chill down my spine. I approached cautiously, and sure enough, it was a small patch of blood, dry and dark. In that instant, my instincts started screaming and took me straight to Ryan and Laura's room. At this point, my legs were trembling as I climbed the stairs. I knew I would have to prepare myself for what I was going to find. When I reached their bedroom door, I took a second to catch my breath. Then I opened it and turned on the light, and there I saw it. My worst fears had materialized. Ryan and Laura were lying on the bed as if they were asleep, but that was just an illusion. They had no sheets on. Their pajamas were stained with a dark liquid that had seeped through to the sheets, and the advanced state of decomposition was evident, both in the bloatedness of their bodies and in the deathly gray of their skin, as well as in the nauseating smell that permeated the room. But the most terrifying thing was the look of terror on their faces. There was no doubt that their death had been brutal. I was paralyzed, unable to look away as I covered my nose and mouth with the bottom of my sweatshirt, as the stench was too unbearable and I was about to vomit. I don't know how long I spent there, immersed in horror, but suddenly I heard a noise behind me and was instantly brought back to reality. It wasn't just any noise, it was footsteps coming up the stairs. My first instinct was to hide, but time was running out, so I barely had time to turn off the light and slip under the bed. In that place, the stench was even more unbearable. It seemed that all the stench of decomposing bodies had accumulated right where I was. And there, in the darkness, as the footsteps drew nearer, I realized that the terror was just beginning. The bedroom door flew open and a shadowy figure appeared in the dim light of the hallway. From my hiding place under the bed, I managed to make out the visitor. It was Roger Harrison, a neighbor from the neighborhood. He had always been a quiet guy, and I never imagined him capable of something like this. But there he was, standing in the doorway, staring at the bodies of Ryan and Laura. I stood motionless, holding my breath. I knew that if he saw me, I was finished. Roger advanced with an eerie calm, his eyes fixed on the bed. When he got close enough to almost brush me with the tips of his boots, he stopped. A few seconds passed that felt like an eternity, and finally he turned and left. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to call the police, so I gathered up all the courage I could and began to move slowly, until I finally reached the back door I'd come in through, but I had no luck. Just as I was about to leave, an object on the kitchen shelf fell to the floor, making a noise that echoed throughout the house. I immediately turned to look, and there was Roger. He turned his gaze towards me with an expression full of murderous fury. I knew then that I had no choice but to run for my life, but I didn't have time to take a single step. Roger lunged at me with almost inhuman speed and strength, throwing me to the ground, and I couldn't avoid him. I immediately felt his hands squeezing my neck with unexpected force. As I struggled to free myself, I groped around for anything I could use as a weapon. Otherwise, this guy would turn me into the third corpse in the house. Fortunately, I found a frying pan on the floor, and with all my strength, I hit him over the head with it. The impact knocked him down, and I took the opportunity to break free from his grip. But instead of running away, I lunged at him again, starting to beat him mercilessly, taking advantage of the fact that he was still dazed. I didn't care if I knocked him unconscious or killed him. I just needed to neutralize him so he couldn't escape when I called the police. In response to my blows, he attacked me using his fingers to press on my eyes. I screamed in pain, and suddenly my vision became completely blurred, and when I looked again, I saw Roger pick up the same frying pan he had used to hit me. But before he could smash it on my head, I threw myself at him, knocking him against a piece of furniture and sending the pan flying. The dishes and objects in the cupboard fell on us as we struggled, but Roger did not give up. On the contrary, he got back up and tried to hit me again, but we both realized at the same time that he got stuck in a kitchen cupboard. As he struggled to get out, I gathered all my strength, got up and ran to the door, calling the neighbors. However, it was not necessary. The neighbors next door had already come out of their houses, curious about the commotion. They thought it was a domestic fight, but they did not expect to see me drenched in blood. Call the police now!" I shouted. The visibly frightened wife of one of the neighbors took out her phone and called 911. At that moment, I fell to the ground, exhausted, just as I heard the sirens approaching. When the officers finally arrived, they found me in a state of shock, unable to utter a word to tell them what had happened, until I could finally stammer that my friends were dead in that house. The officers entered Ryan and Laura's house, and upon discovering what had happened, the gravity of the situation became clear to everyone. Roger Harrison had managed to escape from the closet and fled, but was arrested after a brief confrontation with the police. He was alive, but behind bars forever after having brutally murdered my friends. It turned out that he had started ordering food deliveries so that no one would suspect that they were absent. He later confessed that he had planned to burn down the house, but that the fear of being caught had stopped him. He will never get out of prison, although the pain we all feel at the loss of that couple of friends is irremediable. But there is something else that nobody knew. They took 3 lives, and not just 2. Laura was pregnant when he killed her, even though it had only been a few months since they found out. This whole tragedy left a deep scar in the hearts of all of us who knew and came to love Laura and Ryan so much. It was also a huge shock to everyone in the neighborhood, as this is usually a fairly quiet place where this kind of thing had never happened before. To this day, the image of my neighbors' lifeless bodies on that bed haunts me in my nightmares from time to time. I just hope I can get over it completely one day. When I was at community college, I worked in a pizza place that was practically in the middle of nowhere. It was a lonely place, located in a shopping center by the side of a road in a fairly nice rural area. There were only a few farms scattered around, so the shop never closed completely. But as we hardly made any money, we operated with a minimum team, especially at night. Sometimes there were only two of us, another guy and me. One of us would make the pizzas and the other would serve the customers. The truth is that this system didn't always work perfectly, but we came to the conclusion that Wednesday and Thursday nights were the best days to work, as it was super quiet. You would spend the evening sitting chatting with your partner, and if you were lucky, you might get one or two calls, nothing stressful. However, on a night like any other, we received a call at almost 11 p.m., half an hour before closing time. Normally it would have bothered me, but it was too unusual. At the time, my colleague was outside in his car smoking, so I was alone when the phone rang. Part of me said, "Don't answer, mate," but curiosity got the better of me, because most of the families in the area work on their farms and go to bed early, so who could be calling so late? When I answered, I didn't recognize the voice immediately, but that wasn't unusual. In the end, almost everyone in the area knows what to order when they call. However, what really surprised me was the way this guy was talking. He had a super raspy voice, as if he lived in a sleazy bar and ate cigarettes for breakfast. At that moment, I knew it was going to be a strange call, but I didn't know how strange. The first thing he asked me was if we had hamburgers. "Sir, this is a pizzeria. I can read you the menu if you like," I replied politely. There was no problem, as we only offered 6 varieties of pizza with a couple of side dishes. But then the guy told me he wasn't interested, that he only wanted hamburger meat, raw. I almost had a fit because I assumed he was talking about a burger pizza, and we had one on the menu. I asked him to clarify his order, but no. This guy didn't want pizza, just burger meat, and he made it clear that he wanted it raw. I was shocked, not knowing if that was even legal. I had no idea if you could sell raw hamburger meat, and although I knew that raw meat can be edible as in steak tartare, I thought we should have some food hygiene regulations against that. I looked at my colleague, but he was too annoyed to give me a coherent answer, so in the end I told the guy in all sincerity that I wasn't sure I could sell him raw hamburger meat. Honestly, the conversation felt really weird. There was something unsettling about the way he was talking and what he was asking for, by the way. It was so strange that it almost made me feel uncomfortable. There are moments when the unfamiliar feels like a scam, as if I can sense that something is wrong, and this was the case. I made it clear to the man that I couldn't sell him raw hamburger meat, but the guy started to beg so insistently that I was speechless for a moment. He sounded so anxious, as if he really longed for it, which felt eerie and strange. At that moment, my mind was more confused than ever. But then the guy mentioned that he could afford to tip well and made me rethink things. The truth is that people sometimes do crazy things for money, so I decided to go ahead with the transaction. Throwing what I thought would be a pile of raw hamburger meat into the plastic box, I entered his address into my navigation system and set off for his house. I'd been making deliveries in the county for about 17 months, so it wasn't like I knew every corner. But this particular place was completely unknown to me. I had never seen that old farmhouse before. It was at the end of a long dirt road and was in such a state of disrepair that it looked as if it were about to collapse. The whole place looked so sinister that I felt as if I were in the first scene of a horror movie, with a pizza delivery guy as dumb as me doomed to be the victim of some monstrous creature. I parked my car at the end of the dirt road and walked towards the old porch, which was in a really sorry state. As there was no doorbell, I just knocked on the door, and when he finally opened it, it wasn't what I expected. No, it wasn't an old monster covered in cobwebs, but rather an ordinary guy dressed in a sweater that would remind you of the father of all fathers. So I handed him the bag with the hamburger meat, but I couldn't help but ask why on earth he had ordered raw meat and not a real meal from the menu, assuming he was going to cook it or something. But the guy just smiled and shook his head, telling me he was going to eat it raw. At that moment, I think I completely failed to hide how disgusted I was. The guy, noticing my reaction, launched into a speech about the benefits of eating raw meat. and used a lot of scientific terms that I didn't understand, but he seemed sure of what he was saying. Strangely, his confidence relaxed me a little, at least for a second. As he searched through his wallet, he gave me a $10 tip, crumpling the bills before handing them to me. "Thanks, mate, that's very generous," I said, as I counted the money in my hand. But when I looked up, I saw something that left me frozen. The guy opened the lid of that plastic container, brought it to his nose, and took a deep whiff of what was inside. I don't know what I expected, but it didn't really smell appetizing. It was rather disturbing, and the thing is that while the guy was there smelling the meat, he had this face of excitement, but it was so disturbing that it made my hair stand on end. Just at that moment, I felt it was my cue to leave. I thanked the man awkwardly and was glad to be able to leave that strange property, but just as I was about to turn around, I noticed something moving in the dimly lit hallway behind him. It was a pair of large, terrified eyes staring at me from behind a door, and when I took a closer look, I couldn't believe it. It was a child. I don't know what made me ask, but curiosity got the better of my instinct to run away, so I awkwardly said, "Hey, you're a kid, right?" Instead of smiling or doing something normal for kids, his face changed. Suddenly he looked furious, and then he looked scared. Then he turned and disappeared from view, while the guy just looked at me in a way so intense and dark that it gave me goosebumps. That was yet another sign to get out of there, so I did. But as I walked away towards my car, I never turned my back on him. I always had one eye on him, but he didn't even say a word. He just kept on staring at me with that angry look, as if he had done something very wrong. It took me 20 minutes to get back to the pizzeria, 20 minutes full of confused thoughts, repeating the situation over and over again in my head. I couldn't get the image of the child and the madness I felt when I saw that guy out of my head. As soon as I arrived, I called 911, feeling I had to report what I had witnessed. It was as if I had no idea what was going on in that house, but something was clearly wrong. A child shouldn't be that scared, and if that guy was the father, the matter was even more disturbing. What really scared me was that maybe the policeman they sent wouldn't see the problem and think I had been scared for nothing. But I couldn't risk missing something so serious. So I called the police, and after a while, an officer arrived to investigate. The officer returned and assured me that he had checked the house and that there was nothing unusual. It must have been a relief, but instead I felt even more uneasy. I couldn't believe that the officer was leaving after telling me that everything was fine, as if he couldn't have seen what I had seen. I never delivered any more orders to that house. In fact, I was relieved not to have to face that guy again. But even today, I wonder what was going on with him and his son, if it was his son. The memory of that scene haunts me to this day. The truth is that it tears me apart to think about that child and what was going on in his house. I am tormented by the idea that he might be facing something horrible and that by not intervening I left him alone. Every time I think about it, I ask myself, why didn't I do more? Why didn't I help? That experience left a mark on me. The simple idea that a child could be suffering while I cowardly walked away haunts me to this day. Sometimes the doubt drills me. Why didn't I do something? Hi, my name is Helen, and this happened a long time ago, but it's worth telling. It was an afternoon in March 1973. Back then, I worked in a small pizza place where deliveries by motorbike were not common. And to be honest, most places preferred to make deliveries by bicycle. I was part of the delivery team, but what happened that day changed my life forever. I received an order just before nightfall. I was told that the customer lived in an old house at the end of a long and dusty dirt road. The owner of the pizzeria warned me to hurry, to be back before it got completely dark. And the truth is that the address was strange and not a place we often went to. But the tips in that area were usually very good, so without thinking twice, I grabbed the pizza box, got on my bike, and set off. When I arrived, the house seemed completely abandoned, but I rang the doorbell and waited. There was no answer. So I rang again, and just as I was about to leave, the door opened slowly. A tall, stocky man appeared in the doorway, and as I looked at him, I nodded and handed him the box, waiting for him to pay me. But to my surprise, he told me that the money was inside. I knew it was a bad idea. A small instinct told me that I shouldn't go in, but the pressure was great. It was difficult for a woman to be at work back then, and I had always felt that criticism could fall on me at any moment, so I closed my eyes and decided to go in anyway. I followed the subject down a narrow corridor until we reached a room with the only light coming from a lamp hanging from the ceiling. "Wait here," he said, before disappearing through a door, leaving me alone. A few seconds later, the guy returned with a crumpled note and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. When I reached out my hand to take the money, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, leaving me breathless, and before I could react, he pushed me towards the open door, dragging me into the darkness. I tried to scream, but my voice got caught in my throat. But in the midst of my confusion, I saw him sit me in a chair and tie my hands. But as I looked around, I saw a scene that made my heart stop. In a corner, there were two other women who were also tied up and gagged. Their eyes reflected absolute fear, and at that moment I understood the seriousness of my situation. It was not the first time, and it would possibly not be the last. At that moment, the man tied me up and left, leaving me alone with the other two girls. Those minutes felt like an eternity. What was I doing there? What would happen to me? As thoughts assailed me, the man returned, this time sitting down on an old stool in the basement. He stood watching us in silence, his gaze moving from one to the other, as if making a decision. The other women didn't move, and I could see the terror in their eyes. I tried to keep my cool, but desperation was consuming me. I didn't want to die, and I knew my time was running out. Finally, the man got up and approached the first woman. She started to scream, begging him not to hurt her, but he didn't seem to hear her. Then, without saying a word, he took a knife from his belt and held it in front of her face, and without further warning, he plunged the blade into her chest. Heart skipped a beat. The girl's muffled scream echoed through the cellar, but it was brief. At the same time, blood began to flow, and her body convulsed until it was motionless. I was paralyzed with horror and fear, but when I came to, I began to scream desperately for help. But the gag prevented me from making a sound. At that moment, the man turned towards the second woman and in one swift movement slit her throat. The cut was so deep and so fast that the blood gushed out in a jet, splattering the walls, him and also me. Once again, silence invaded the basement as he killed one after another, until only I was left. I can swear to you that never in my life had I felt such terror as at that moment, neither before nor since. I was paralyzed, with my heart pounding in my chest like a hammer, and I knew that now it was my turn. But before I could even process the fear, a noise interrupted the macabre ritual of that ruthless killer. Someone was knocking on the cellar door. The man stopped dead in his tracks, his expression somewhere between surprise and fury. Then he looked at me, signaling with his finger to his mouth to keep quiet. He put the knife down and went up the stairs, but it was too late. The door had already been opened and a man was peering out from behind it. The guy went up quickly while the man behind the door looked on in horror and asked him, "What is this? What's going on here?" To my surprise and relief, or at least at that moment, the man was his father. The confusion and horror on his face was otherworldly. The man was in shock. At that moment, the flame of hope was ignited in me, because judging by his expression, that man had no idea what his son was doing, so he was not an accomplice. Fate had given me a chance, and with a bit of luck, I could get out of there alive. However, those hopes quickly faded. In the blink of an eye, the guy started stabbing his own father over and over again with the knife. I counted over 30 times that he stabbed him, without the victim trying to defend himself, as if he had already lost all hope. The old man's inert body collapsed to the ground, while the monster breathed at full speed, his chest rising and falling like a wild beast. After a while, the man dragged his father's lifeless body, leaving a trail of blood on the floor, and dropped it at the foot of the basement stairs. In my mind, I knew I had to die too, but it wasn't time yet. I realized that he forgot to close the door, and that was a small window of opportunity. The murderer stood there, silent. I tried to talk to him, to beg him to let me go, but it was as if I didn't exist for him. He completely ignored me. The minutes turned into hours, and despair slowly turned into resignation, as the guy sat next to me with a blank stare, frozen, not making the slightest movement. Then after a while, I heard what sounded like footsteps approaching. "Mom, I'm in the basement, come on." "Something's happened to Dad," she said, and terror washed over me again. I shook my head, feeling my heart drop to my feet, and as she came down the stairs, I decided it was best to take the man's advice and not scream. My heart broke at the knowledge of what was about to happen, but I couldn't risk my life for a stranger. That female figure drew nearer and nearer, and when she reached the foot of the stairs, her gaze met the picture of horror that was in the basement. The bodies of the women she had murdered, the fresh blood on the floor, and her husband lying right at her feet. The woman froze for a moment, her face distorted by disbelief, but before she could react, the guy came out of hiding, walking slowly towards her with a small hammer in his hand. The lady started to scream, but he didn't give her time. With a brutal movement, he hit her on the head and then again, and so on over and over again. The cracking of the hammer echoed, and each blow was a horrible echo in the darkness. She was an old woman. I couldn't understand what on earth she had done to deserve such a fate. The murderous violence of that man was incomprehensible, and I felt so traumatized that I could only sob, as if it had happened to me. Finally, her body lay motionless on the floor, and the guy, panting, had his hands covered in his own mother's blood. He looked at me, and for a second there was a stir of confusion on his face. "Relax, it's all over now," he said in a distant tone. It seemed that the weight of what he had done was finally crushing him. Then, without saying anything else, he went over to a wall where there was a telephone. He picked up the receiver and dialed 3 numbers, and then, without further ado, he said, "Hello, this is Freddie. I've just killed my mother and some other people." He gave his address to the operator, and after hanging up, he stared into space as if he were in another world. He didn't look like a guy who had just committed several murders. I was completely paralyzed, my body trembling with panic, and I just prayed to God that he wouldn't remember me, and apparently my pleas were heard. At one point, Freddie simply went upstairs and left the basement. A few minutes passed that seemed eternal, and suddenly I heard sirens in the distance. The police had arrived. Red and blue lights filtered through the small basement windows, and soon after I heard hurried footsteps and voices giving orders. Then the basement door flew open, and suddenly a beam of light illuminated the staircase. A group of policemen came down with their weapons drawn, ready for anything, and when they saw me, their expressions went from alert to horror. One of them ran towards me and began to untie me while another approached the bodies on the ground, confirming what was already feared. There were more dead. In the days that followed, Freddie's story became national news. The police discovered evidence of other crimes, of young women who had disappeared and were never heard of again. I was questioned over and over again, wondering if I knew more than I really did. The media also harassed me, asking increasingly morbid questions about him, until I decided to stop talking to them. Freddie, not his real name, but I don't want to mention him, was tried and convicted. And believe it or not, he's still alive. Nobody seems to know what goes on in that killer's mind as he satisfies his thirst for blood. Rumor has it that he's eager to break out of his life sentence and go out looking for more victims. And deep down, he knew that if he ever managed to escape, I would surely be his first choice. So my nightmare ended. But not a day goes by when I don't feel a chill at the thought that I might run into him again. I've always thought that the best era was before there were apps for ordering. In those days, if you wanted something, you had to pick up the phone and call. People could think twice before ordering, which is something that has gone with the apps that make everything easier. It's as if the creators of these apps had forgotten that, in the end, There always needs to be someone to deliver the food. Now, people order what they want when they want it without thinking about it too much. Of course, the business has exploded. The order history has grown like crazy in recent years, especially during and after the pandemic. The other day, I was organizing my things after making my last delivery, and just when I thought I could go home, boom, another order came in. I almost cursed whoever had made the order, but in any case, the delivery fell to me. I had to wait another 20 minutes while they packed the food, but luckily my boss let me log off once I'd delivered the order, so I thought it would only be a minor inconvenience. 30 minutes later, I was already pedaling on my bike. The address of the order seemed strange to me, but according to the map, it wasn't too far from my neighborhood, and that explained why it was my turn. Still, I wondered why someone would choose to live in such a remote area. But you know, curiosity and a bit of adventure sometimes take me to interesting places. 10 minutes after leaving the restaurant, I found myself in a neighborhood that was more deserted than any other I had ever seen. Suddenly, as I rounded the bend leading away from the main street, I began to understand why the address had sounded so strange. I was surrounded by houses in ruins. I thought about turning around and telling my boss that I'd probably been pranked, but then I saw a house with a light on in one of the windows. So, taking a deep breath, I headed there, because the map led me exactly to that house. I couldn't believe that someone would live in such a rundown place, and I imagined that that person must feel as lost as the house itself. But well, I was already there. I got off the bike, quickly took the order and approached the entrance. I knocked on the door twice, but nothing. Total silence. I knocked again, hoping that someone would answer, and after about 4 or 5 minutes, there was still no response. So I looked around for a doorbell, but there was nothing. Then, as if something irresistible was pushing me, I decided to turn the doorknob, and to my surprise, it turned easily and the door opened by itself. Without thinking, I entered the house, knocking quite heartily. I didn't know if it was me who was taking risks or if I was being invited, but the atmosphere was strange. The silence was dense and the air felt heavy. But well, it was my job, so I crossed the threshold of that mysterious house, wondering who lived there. "Hi, I'm here from the restaurant with your order," I said, leaving the door ajar in case I needed to run out. The house was surrounded by such a dense silence that it gave me chills, as if time had stopped there. It looked like no one had lived there for years. The living room had a dusty air, and every step I took made the floor creak, so I walked so carefully that I could have won a prize for it. It was dark, and I had to rely on the flashlight on my cell phone to see anything, so I went poking my head into each room before heading to the one with the light on. But in all of them, everything was empty and covered in dust. I didn't like to snoop where I shouldn't, but I couldn't help wondering why someone would live in such a strange place. My steps quickened when I reached the room, and I quickly knocked on the door, but I didn't wait for an answer. I just turned the doorknob and went in. I expected to see someone, but the room turned out to be as empty as the others. However, there was a noticeable difference in this one. The bed was made and everything seemed clean and in order. It didn't smell abandoned, so it was clear that someone lived there. I felt that I had snooped enough already, so I turned to leave, but suddenly I noticed something in a corner. A cell phone. Curiosity pushed me again, so I left the order on the bed and went towards the phone. But as I approached, something behind the table caught my attention, and what I saw left me paralyzed. I screamed, involuntarily, at what I had found. A young woman was lying on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood, with her hands tied behind her back and some visible bruises on her legs. It looked like she had been fighting for her life. Her gaze was completely lost, and suddenly I understood why she hadn't answered the door and why someone had ordered food. My mind was racing at that moment. I thought about calling 911, but as I picked up the phone, I realized that my hands were stained with blood. That's when I realized that the device was also soaked in his blood. But to my surprise, the number 911 was more recent on the call list. Suddenly, another call came in, but just as I was about to answer, a group of uniformed men entered the house and pointed their guns at me. What was I going to say? I just came to deliver an order. But that sounded so ridiculous even to me. I had gone as far as the girl's room and now I was there, my hands full of blood next to her dead body. Nobody believed me, not my boss, not the investigators. I had broken the #1 rule by entering a stranger's house, sneaking out like a criminal. My fingerprints were everywhere and there was no alibi to clear me. So they arrested me and took me to prison as if I were a murderer. At the trial, I was found guilty of the murder of that young woman. I was locked up with other criminals, and in every corner, I felt my self-hatred grow. I clearly remember that I fell into this trap out of curiosity, and now every time I try to sleep, the image of that woman comes back to haunt me. No matter how many times I close my eyes, I cannot escape that vision. Sometimes I wonder if it was me who killed her even though I didn't know the story behind her tragic end. But what's the point of thinking about that if I'm trapped here now, in this nightmare of a prison? I was never one of those people who ordered food all the time. My girlfriend and I love to cook, so we usually make delicious things at home. But one day, for some reason, we didn't feel like doing anything, so we decided to try a new pizzeria that had opened a couple of months ago, but we had no idea what was coming. We were inviting a dangerous and bloodthirsty guy to our house, someone who would soon become one of the most horrendous and unknown serial killers. 30 minutes after placing the order, the doorbell rang. It was the delivery guy. He looked like a normal guy, maybe a little younger than me, wearing the typical delivery guy jacket and cap covering his messy hair. He handed me the pizza and the change, and everything seemed fine until I noticed him staring at me over my shoulder. I turned around and there was my girlfriend sitting on the sofa watching TV. "Is something wrong?" I asked her, but he just shook his head. "Nothing, I just thought I saw something," he replied, while that strange feeling kept gnawing at me. The delivery man smiled at me again, but this time his smile seemed much more forced. And when I gave him the change, I closed the door and went back to the living room with the strange pizza. I tried to forget about it while we had dinner, and by the time I started eating, I had really put the uneasiness that guy had left me behind me. However, in the following days, I began to notice strange things. The same delivery man was coming to my house several times a day. At first I thought he was just doing his route, but it started to make me uncomfortable when I saw him stopping in front of our house at night, parking his bike a few houses away, and just standing there watching. I tried to ignore him, but every time I saw him, a feeling of unease would come over me. One day our eyes met and he didn't even bother to look away and just smiled at me. But that smile gave me goosebumps. I told my girlfriend, but she just laughed and told me he was probably doing his job and maybe he lived nearby, but that explanation didn't calm me at all. One night, as I tried to sleep, I heard a soft tapping on the window. I got up and approached cautiously, and as I leaned forward, I saw someone standing in front of our house looking up. It was him, the delivery man, and he had something in his hand, something I couldn't make out in the dark, but I felt a mixture of fear and indignation that I can't describe to you. What the hell was he doing there? But when I went down to confront him, he was gone. From that night on, things got worse. The delivery guy started calling me on my phone, but he would just stay silent on the other end of the line, breathing heavily. He never said a word, but I knew it was him. I tried calling the pizzeria to complain, but to my horror, I discovered that the guy had quit weeks ago, so why was he still dressed in that uniform? The situation was becoming increasingly disturbing. I finally decided to talk to the police, but they only said that they couldn't do much without clear evidence that he had committed a crime. I was feeling increasingly distressed, and I began to fear for my girlfriend's and my own safety. It was as if a monster were lurking, and I didn't know what to do to keep us safe. The tension grew, and every little sound in the house made me jump. One night, after weeks of dealing with the harassment from the delivery man, I was woken up again by the sound of stones hitting the window. As I went downstairs to see what was happening, I looked towards the kitchen and suddenly felt my heart stop. I had forgotten to close the window before going to bed, and as I entered, the icy air sent a chill down my spine. I turned on the light, but there was no one in sight. However, it didn't take me long to find him. The delivery man was standing in the corner of the kitchen, and not only that, but he was dressed like Freddy Krueger, that famous dream killer. The guy with his mask on didn't say a word, just stared at me with a disturbing look while holding long, rusty scissors in his right hand. I tried to back away, but he moved quickly and blocked my exit. "What do you want? What are you doing in my house?" I asked him, trying to remain calm. "Freddy's coming for you. Leave now," he said in a cold voice. "I'm going to call the police," I warned him. But he just started singing, 3, 4, "You'd better lock your door," the creepy song from that TV series. In a fit of rage, the man lunged at me, and although I managed to dodge him, I felt the edge of the scissors graze my arm. A stabbing pain shot through me as a shallow cut opened in my skin. Then I ran towards the living room, but he followed closely behind, quickly catching up. "Hold on to your crucifix," he shouted as I tripped over a chair, but I managed to keep my balance and grab a standing lamp, throwing it with all my strength. The impact stopped him for a second, but didn't knock him over. "Stay awake," he shouted at me. Suddenly, the madman started running towards me. He was faster than I imagined, and I knew I didn't have much time, so I ran towards the stairs, going up 2 at a time, my mind blank with terror. At least my girlfriend was at her sister's house that night, so I reached the master bedroom and locked the door. Then I heard the footsteps getting closer, as if he was enjoying every second of the chase. Everything suddenly went silent, and all I could hear was my own heavy breathing. Suddenly, I felt the guy trying to open the door, knowing that he wanted to scare me, and on a desperate impulse, I threw myself against the door with all the strength I had. Taking advantage of his momentary surprise, I ran down the hall, looking for a way to escape, or at least something I could use to defend myself. And I ran to the guest room, closing the door behind me and securing it with whatever I could find. The window was tightly closed, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. Then I heard his footsteps approaching again, and my mind was spinning as I tried to think of a way out of this madness. Finally, I realized that the only way to solve this was to face him, and if I managed to take the scissors away from him, maybe I could get out of this nightmare alive. So I searched through an old cupboard and found a toolbox from which I took a hammer. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Hey, stop hiding. You know Freddy will find you and you have to sleep sometime, don't you?" he shouted. I took a deep breath, preparing for the inevitable. The banging on the door began to echo, and I knew it wouldn't be long before the guy broke in. Just then, the door gave way, and the madman came in, still wearing his Freddy Krueger mask and scissors in hand. He didn't hold back for a second. He lunged at me, trying to stab me in the chest with the scissors, but I managed to back away just in time, and to his surprise, I took out the hammer and tried to hit him in the head. I missed the shot, but I made him stagger, which allowed him to back away a little, so I seized the moment and lunged at him, pushing him with all my strength against the cupboard. I fell on top of him and started punching him. But at that moment, I felt a sharp pain in my leg. I had kneeled on it with the scissors. The pain was so bad that I fell to one side, trying to grab the hammer again, but he took my weapon away from me and dragged me out of the room. It was then that I realized that I still had the scissors in my leg, so I was no longer armed. I tried to hit him with the hammer, but he backed away, taking it to the center of the room. I took the opportunity and ran to close the door behind me, locking him in. The guy was banging on the door in desperation, but he couldn't open it. "I'm going to call the police," I shouted at him, hoping my voice sounded firm. And after a few seconds, the sound of his banging stopped and I heard a creak. I opened the door quickly, although I hesitated at the last moment, thinking that I had made a big mistake. When I opened it, I got distracted and saw that man running away in terror, trying to escape. That was the last time I saw him near my house. I notified the police, and a few days later they caught him, but by then he had done a lot of damage. In that short span of time, he had murdered more than 4 people. His name was Daniel Gonzalez, and he would later be known as the Freddy Krueger Killer, a guy who killed people dressed as horror characters for no apparent reason, just for fun. And although he did not confess, the authorities suspect that he had murdered many more people than were discovered. Not a day goes by that I don't wonder what would have happened if I hadn't confronted that madman. My wife and I could have been on that list of victims. The face I saw on the screen was very strange. I had been surfing the internet long enough to realize that something didn't quite add up, and this particular image left me completely confused, as the line between reality and artificial intelligence was becoming increasingly blurred. And I had been interacting with this model so much that I no longer knew what was real and what was generated by AI. So I looked again at the nose in the image to see if there were any noticeable differences, but no. It was perfect, as any human feature would be in a normal photo. My heart began to beat fast, pounding in the small space in my throat and reverberating in my mouth. I was so excited that I started to sweat a little. It had all been worth it, and that was all that mattered. I analyzed the small detail of the prototype that my artificial intelligence had created and was very satisfied. He had dark skin with a small white spot on his curly, abundant hair. He had no beard or mustache, and his eyes were disproportionately large, almost like a caricature, but I assumed that was just a glitch in the program. The details of his fingers and nose were impressive, but I counted his fingers twice just to make sure. We had done it. Although it was still not right to say we, it had all been me working in this little corner I called my own, and now I was ready to go out into the world with a program that could make me a millionaire. The adrenaline made my heart feel like it was going to fall into my stomach, and it protested with a loud noise. I realized that I had eaten practically nothing in 2 days. I had barely drunk water once, in fact, and that revelation made me hungrier. So I made a quick decision. I needed something to eat, and soon. So I took out my phone and called a fast food delivery app. I could already imagine a giant, juicy hamburger, maybe even 3 of them, because I deserved it. I had left programmers speechless for years, and I had done this out of pure defiance. The most perfect image of a man generated by artificial intelligence. And while I waited for the app to open, I moved the fingers of my other hand over my stomach, trying to calm the pang of hunger. Suddenly, the screen lit up, but it was only for a moment. Then the application stopped and began to load indefinitely. I frowned as a drop of sweat began to slide down my forehead and ended up on my nose. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it. I just closed the application and waited for a while, visualizing the double cheeseburgers I was about to eat. I tried to open the application again, but the image that appeared on my screen was not the same. What was previously a perfect face now showed a nose piercing and a small tattoo under the eyes. I stared at it, incredulous. I turned pale when I saw that the colors of the application had also changed. I looked around and everything seemed normal in my room, but the air was a little heavy. It was as if a shadow had slipped across my mind, sending shivers down to my very bones. Any doubts I might have had evaporated the moment I noticed that the room was starting to get dark. The light from the screen continued to illuminate my face, but it was no longer a warm reflection. Now it seemed like a warning, as if something were lurking. As my stomach continued to protest, I felt caught between the excitement of my creation and a growing sense of unease. What was going on? I felt the line between success and horror blurring more and more. I was convinced that the color of the interface was a nice orange, but now it had turned bright red. How strange, I muttered as I finalized the order. I filled in the details and pressed the send button, and at that moment my phone rang with a beep that broke the silence of the night. I looked at the screen and wondered at what point the night had become so strange. "Hello," I replied when I answered the call. It was the delivery man. "I'm just letting you know that your order is on its way and I'm just around the corner," he said. I was shocked. I started rubbing my eyes. I couldn't believe it. My order was crazy. I had ordered a triple burger. There was no way I could have it already. "Are you sure you have the right order?" I asked, nervously swallowing. "I'm right outside your door, Miss Kate," he replied, and suddenly, fear replaced my hunger. An icy feeling ran through my body. How come this man said my real name? I never used my real name on those apps. My heart began to beat fast, and I grabbed the edge of my desk to keep from swaying. A cold sweat soaked me as I tried to face what was to come. I approached the door carefully, breathing deeply, and when I opened it, I was paralyzed at the sight of the delivery man. His face rang a bell. It was as if I had seen him before. He moved with confidence, smiling as he silently handed me the package. My God, it was him. It was the image I had generated a moment ago. And now he was there in front of me in the flesh. My body went rigid. I couldn't understand what was happening. Everything was happening quickly while I was paralyzed. "I've come to bring you what you asked for," he said, coming a little closer. "It's from Hans Grill," he said as he handed me the package, but I was still paralyzed. However, in a flash of clarity, I remembered that this was the most famous food delivery chain in the state. I had always said that their meat had a strange flavor, different from anything I had tasted. At that moment, reality seemed to falter beneath my feet, and I felt the ground move. "Kate!" they called to me, and that voice was familiar, like an echo that awakened something in me. Suddenly, I felt a slippery hand on my shoulder that brought me back from my little hallucinatory trip. I blinked, regaining my bearings and realizing that everything I had experienced had been just a strange dream. "You don't look like you slept well," said a voice next to me, and I turned to see one of my coworkers. "Today I've been working on AI development," he added with a smile. At that moment, I thanked God in my mind that all the horror I had experienced in my dream was not real. I finally placed my order and was able to eat my triple burgers. But that dream was so vivid that to this day I remember it in detail. As if it had really happened, I don't know, in a parallel dimension perhaps. The truth is that whenever I remember it, I get chills.